The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you get at sunrise when the dew is still heavy on the grass and the world hasn't quite woken up yet. This was the wrong kind of silence. The kind that settles over a place when something that should be there is missing. I stood on my back porch at 6:42 in the morning, with a cup of coffee cooling in my hand, and listened for the familiar sounds that weren't coming. No soft bleating, no hooves shuffling through the dry straw inside the pen. No occasional headbutt against the metal gate that always sounded like someone tapping a spoon against a pot. Just the wind moving through the pines and the distant hum of a lawnmower 3 streets over. I set the coffee down on the railing and walked across the wet grass toward the goat pen. The gate was open, not broken, not damaged, just open, swung wide like someone had unlatched it and walked away without bothering to close it behind them. The pen was empty. All 12 of my goats were gone. The water trough was still half full. The hay feeder had fresh flakes from yesterday afternoon. The mineral block was untouched. Everything looked normal, except for the fact that there were no animals inside the enclosure. I stood there for a long moment trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Goats don't just vanish. They don't unlatch their own gates and wander off in a coordinated group like they're staging some kind of livestock escape. Someone had taken them. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 6:47 a.m. I had been awake for less than 20 minutes and my entire small livestock operation had disappeared. Before I explain what happened next, tell me where you're watching from. I'd like to know who's out there listening to this particular brand of suburban insanity. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and I own a small property on the edge of the Willow Creek HOA community in Central Texas. The house sits on 3.5 acres, which isn't much by ranch standards, but it's enough for a dozen Nigerian dwarf goats, a modest vegetable garden, and a workshop where I restore old furniture. The goats aren't just pets. They're part of a small business I've been building for the past 4 years. I breed and raise registered Nigerian dwarves for dairy and brush clearing contracts. It's not going to make me rich, but it pays the mortgage and keeps me connected to something my father started before he passed. My dad was a livestock man his whole life. He grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin and moved to Texas in his 20s, with nothing but a truck and a handshake agreement to manage someone else's herd. By the time I was born, he had built his own small operation from scratch. Nothing fancy, just good animals, honest work, and a reputation for keeping his word. When he got sick 3 years ago, I promised him I would keep the goats going. Not as a hobby, not as a side project, as a real business. He died on a Tuesday in October. I took over the herd the following Monday. Every goat in that pen had a name, a registration number, and a purpose. They weren't just livestock to me. They were the last thing my father and I built together. So when I found the pen empty that morning, I didn't panic. I didn't scream or call 911 or start running through the neighborhood like a crazy person. I did what my father taught me to do when something goes wrong on a farm. I stopped. I looked. I thought. And then I started documenting. The first thing I did was take photos of the open gate, the empty pen, the undisturbed water trough, and the tire tracks in the gravel driveway that didn't match my truck. The tracks were from a wider vehicle, something with dual rear wheels, a trailer maybe. The gravel was still damp from the overnight sprinklers, and the impressions were sharp and fresh. I took close-ups of the tread pattern with my phone, then walked the perimeter of the property looking for any other signs of entry. Nothing was broken, nothing was cut. Whoever took the goats had opened the gate from the inside, which meant they had walked right up to the pen like they belonged there. I went back inside, pulled up the security camera footage on my laptop, and found exactly what I expected. At 5:14 a.m., a white Ford F-350 with HOA markings on the door pulled into my driveway. The truck was towing a livestock trailer. A woman in khaki pants and a green polo shirt got out of the driver's side, walked directly to the goat pen, unlatched the gate, and began loading my animals into the trailer. She worked efficiently, like someone who had done this before. It took her about 20 minutes to load all 12 goats. At 5:37 a.m., she closed the trailer door, got back in the truck, and drove away. She never knocked on my door. She never called. She never left a note. She just took my goats like she was picking up a curbside grocery order. I recognized her immediately. Her name was Patricia Calloway. She was the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, the chair of the Environmental Committee, and the self-appointed guardian of everything green within the community's boundaries. I had dealt with her twice before. Once over the height of my fence, which she claimed violated the community aesthetic standards, even though my property wasn't technically inside the HOA's jurisdiction. And once over the noise from my workshop, which she insisted was disturbing the peace, despite the fact that my nearest neighbor was 400 yards away and had never complained about anything. Both times she had backed down after I showed her the property records. Both times she had left with a tight smile and a vague threat about how the board would be reviewing my status. I hadn't heard from her in over a year, and now she had my goats. I didn't call her right away. I didn't call the police either. I sat at my kitchen table, finished my coffee, and thought about what my father would have done. He would have gathered information first. He would have understood exactly what he was dealing with before he made a single move. So I opened Facebook, and there it was. Posted at 6:02 a.m., 45 minutes before I even woke up, was a photo album on the Willow Creek HOA community page. The album was titled Willow Creek Natural Brush Clearing Initiative, and it featured 12 photos of my goats grazing in the HOA common area. The caption read, "Proud to announce our new eco-friendly landscaping program. These beautiful animals will be helping us maintain our common areas naturally, saving the community thousands in contractor fees. Special thanks to our environmental committee for making this happen. Go Green, Willow Creek." Patricia Calloway had tagged herself in every photo. She was standing next to my goats with her arms crossed and a smile that looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. The comments were already piling up. Residents were praising her initiative. Someone called her a visionary. Another person used the word inspiring. A third comment said this was exactly the kind of forward-thinking leadership the community needed. No one asked where the goats came from. No one asked if they belonged to anyone. No one seemed to care that a dozen registered dairy goats had apparently materialized out of thin air for the HOA's convenience. I scrolled through the photos slowly, saving each one to my phone. My goats looked healthy but stressed. They were clustered together in an unfamiliar field, surrounded by people they didn't know, eating brush they hadn't been conditioned for. Nigerian dwarves are browsers, not grazers. They'll eat brush, sure, but they need specific forage management to stay healthy. You can't just drop them in a random field and expect them to thrive. Patricia Calloway clearly didn't know that. Or she didn't care. I closed Facebook and opened my email. There was a message from my niece, Emma, who was 17 and helped me with the goats on weekends. She had seen the HOA post and was already texting me in all caps. "Uncle Daniel, why are your goats on the HOA page?" I told her to stay calm and not say anything publicly yet. Then I called the one person I knew would understand exactly how badly Patricia Calloway had just screwed up. His name was Marcus Webb. He was the livestock officer for our county, and he had been a friend of my father's for over 20 years. Marcus answered on the second ring. His voice was gravelly and slow, like someone who had been awake since 4 in the morning and had already dealt with 3 emergencies before breakfast. "Daniel," he said, "you're calling early." "Patricia Calloway took my goats," I said. Silence. Then, she did what? I explained the situation. The open gate, the security footage, the Facebook post, the HOA brush clearing initiative. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, there was another long pause. "You have the footage," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have the footage," I said. "I have the photos. I have the Facebook post. I have the tire tracks in my driveway. And I have the grazing contract." That last part made him exhale slowly. "The grazing contract," he repeated. "The one with the Henderson farm. The one for $18,000. That's the one," I said. "The contract that says my goats are supposed to be on a private farm 40 miles from here starting next Monday. The contract that Patricia Calloway just made impossible to fulfill because she decided to use my livestock for her little eco-photo op." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made me feel the first flicker of satisfaction I'd felt all morning. "I'll be there in an hour," he said. "Don't call her yet. Don't call the sheriff yet. Let her keep posting. Let her keep talking. The more she says, the worse this gets for her." I hung up and went back to the kitchen. My coffee was cold. I made a fresh pot and waited. The grazing contract Marcus mentioned was the biggest deal I had ever landed. The Henderson family owned a 400-acre organic farm, about 40 miles east of my property. They needed brush clearing services for a section of their land that had become overgrown with invasive species. Nigerian dwarf goats are perfect for that kind of work. They're small enough to navigate tight spaces, they're efficient browsers, and they don't damage the soil like heavy machinery does. The contract was for 6 weeks of managed grazing, starting next Monday. The total value was $18,400. That was more money than I made in an average year. It was going to cover my mortgage for the next 8 months. It was going to pay for the new fencing I'd been planning. It was going to let me expand the herd next spring. And now, because Patricia Calloway had decided my goats were community property, that contract was in serious jeopardy. The Henderson farm required the goats to be healthy, conditioned, and ready for managed grazing. If they spent even a few days eating random brush in an HOA common area, they could develop digestive issues. Nigerian dwarves are sensitive to sudden dietary changes. Bloat, enterotoxemia, and acidosis are real risks when goats are moved to unfamiliar forage without a transition period. Patricia Calloway didn't know any of that. She saw goats and thought lawnmowers with legs. By the time Marcus arrived, I had compiled a folder of evidence. The security footage was saved to a USB drive. The Facebook post was screenshotted and printed. The photos of the tire tracks were labeled with timestamps. The grazing contract was in a clear plastic sleeve. I had also pulled up the property records showing that my land was not part of the Willow Creek HOA. It never had been. When my father bought this property in 1998, he specifically chose a parcel outside the HOA boundaries. The developer had tried to include it, but my father refused. He didn't want anyone telling him what color to paint his barn or how tall his fence could be. The recorded deed was clear. My 3.5 acres were not subject to HOA covenants, restrictions, or authority. Patricia Calloway knew this. I had shown her the deed during our first confrontation about the fence. She had argued that the HOA still had jurisdiction over aesthetic standards for properties adjacent to the community. I had pointed out that adjacency was not the same as membership, and she had eventually backed down. But apparently she had decided that my goats were fair game anyway. Marcus pulled into my driveway at 8:15 a.m. His county truck was dusty, and the livestock trailer hitch was still attached to the back. He got out carrying a clipboard and a digital camera. "Show me the pen," he said. We walked to the goat enclosure together. Marcus examined the gate, the latch, the tire tracks, and the empty pen, with the same methodical attention he used when investigating livestock theft cases. He took photos of everything. He measured the tire impressions with a small ruler he pulled from his pocket. He checked the security camera angles and asked me to walk him through the footage again. "This is clean," he said finally. She didn't try to hide what she was doing. She drove an HOA vehicle. She posted photos online. She tagged herself. "She's either very confident or very stupid." "Both," I said. "She's been on the board for 6 years. She thinks the rules don't apply to her." Marcus nodded slowly. "I've dealt with her type before. They mistake authority for ownership. They think being in charge means they can take whatever they want." He looked at the empty pen again. "The Henderson contract. You said it starts Monday." "Next Monday," I said. "The goats need to be on site by 8 a.m. They need a health certificate from the vet, which I was supposed to get this Friday. They need to be in good condition. If they show up stressed, underweight, or sick, the contract has a performance clause. Henderson can cancel and I don't get paid." Marcus wrote something on his clipboard. "So Patricia Calloway didn't just steal your goats. She created a measurable business loss. Theft of livestock, trespassing, conversion of property, and tortious interference with a contract. That's 4 separate issues before we even get to the animal welfare concerns." He looked up at me. "You want to handle this quietly, or do you want to make sure she never does this to anyone else?" I thought about my father. I thought about the promise I made to him. I thought about the $18,000 that was supposed to change everything for my small operation. "I want her to understand what she did," I said. "I want the community to understand. And I want my goats back healthy." Marcus smiled slightly. "Then let's go have a conversation with the HOA president." We drove to the Willow Creek common area in Marcus's county truck. The HOA maintained about 15 acres of shared green space, including a small pond, a walking trail, and a picnic pavilion. The brush clearing initiative was happening in the northeast corner, where a patch of overgrown land had been designated for natural landscaping. When we arrived, there was already a small crowd. Patricia Calloway was standing near the goat pen she had set up in the common area. It was a temporary enclosure made of orange plastic fencing and metal stakes. My goats were inside, looking confused and uncomfortable. A teenage volunteer was filling a water bucket from a hose. A photographer was taking pictures of the goats eating brush, and several residents were standing around with coffee cups, watching the scene like it was a community festival. Patricia spotted us immediately. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly when she recognized me. "Daniel," she said, walking toward us with her hand extended like she was greeting a guest at a garden party. "What a pleasant surprise. I see you found our little initiative." I didn't shake her hand. "Those are my goats," I said. Her smile stayed in place, but something flickered behind it. "Your goats were wandering," she said. "I saw them near the property line early this morning. They were clearly loose and unsupervised. I thought it would be better to put them to good use rather than let them cause damage." She said this loudly enough for the nearby residents to hear. A couple of them nodded. One woman murmured something about community spirit. "They weren't wandering," I said. "They were inside a locked pen on my property. You opened the gate. You loaded them into a trailer. You drove them here. I have security footage of the entire thing." The smile finally twitched. Patricia's eyes darted to Marcus, who was standing beside me with his clipboard and his county badge visible on his belt. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "The board has been discussing a natural brush clearing program for months. When I saw the goats near the boundary, I assumed they were available for community use." "You assumed wrong," I said. "Those goats are registered livestock. They're part of a commercial operation. They're under a private grazing contract worth $18,000, and you just took them without permission." The word 18,000 landed like a stone in a pond. The residents stopped murmuring. The photographer lowered her camera. The teenage volunteer looked up from the water bucket with wide eyes. Patricia's smile was gone now. Her face had shifted into something harder. $18,000, she repeated. "That seems like an exaggeration." "It's not," Marcus said, speaking for the first time. He pulled a copy of the grazing contract from his clipboard and held it up. "This is a legally binding agreement between Mr. Mercer and the Henderson Organic Farm. The contract specifies that the goats must be delivered in good health and condition by next Monday. Any delay, illness, or failure to perform constitutes a breach. Mr. Mercer stands to lose the full contract value if the goats are not returned immediately and in proper condition." Patricia's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, and then something that looked almost like fear. "This is ridiculous," she said. "I was helping the community. These goats were going to save us thousands in landscaping costs. The board approved this initiative." "You didn't have board approval to steal livestock?" Marcus said. His voice was calm but firm. "You entered private property without permission. You removed registered animals without consent. You transported them without health certificates or movement permits. And you exposed them to unfamiliar forage without veterinary oversight. That's not an initiative. That's a series of violations." One of the residents, a man in his 50s with a Willow Creek polo shirt, stepped forward. "Wait," he said. "Are you saying Patricia took these goats from someone's private property?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," I said. "She drove onto my land at 5 in the morning, opened my goat pen, loaded 12 registered Nigerian dwarves into an HOA trailer, and brought them here without asking me. Then she posted photos online and called it a community initiative." The man looked at Patricia. "Is that true?" Patricia's composure cracked. "They were near the property line," she said. "The gate was open. I thought—" "You thought wrong," I said. "And now you're going to return my goats, pay for the veterinary examination they're going to need, and explain to the Henderson farm why their grazing contractor might not be able to fulfill the agreement." The crowd had grown. More residents had wandered over from the walking trail and the picnic pavilion. Someone was recording on their phone. The teenage volunteer had set down the water bucket and was backing away from the goat pen like she didn't want to be associated with any of this. Patricia looked around at the faces of her neighbors, the people who had been praising her on Facebook an hour ago, the people who had called her a visionary and an inspiration. They weren't smiling anymore. They looked confused, concerned. Some of them looked angry. "This is a misunderstanding," Patricia said again, but her voice had lost its polished confidence. "I'll return the goats immediately. We can sort this out without involving lawyers." "Too late for that," I said. "I've already contacted my attorney. The livestock officer is here documenting everything. And the Henderson farm has been notified that their contractor's animals were taken without authorization." Patricia's face went pale. "You contacted the farm?" "Of course I did," I said. "They're paying me $18,000. They have a right to know why their grazing schedule might be delayed." The man in the polo shirt stepped forward again. His name was Richard something. I'd seen him at community meetings before. He was on the board, but he wasn't one of Patricia's allies. He was the treasurer, and he had a reputation for being careful with money. "Patricia," he said slowly, Did you use HOA resources to take these goats? The truck, the trailer, the volunteer, the photographer? Did any of this go through the board? Patricia didn't answer. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The truck is HOA property, Richard continued. The trailer was purchased last year for maintenance equipment. The volunteer is part of the Youth Community Service Program. If you used all of that without board approval to take someone's private livestock, the HOA could be liable. The HOA is not liable, Patricia snapped. I was acting in my capacity as Environmental Committee Chair. The committee has authority to implement green initiatives. Not on private property, Richard said. Not without permission. Not by taking someone's animals. Marcus cleared his throat. I'm going to need to document the condition of the goats, he said. Mr. Mercer, do you want to inspect them now? I walked over to the temporary pen. My goats recognized me immediately. They crowded against the orange plastic fencing, bleeding and pushing toward my hands. I checked each one carefully. Their coats were dusty. A couple of them had minor scratches from the brush. One of the does, a sweet little blue-eyed girl named Clover, was holding her back legs slightly off the ground. Nothing looked immediately life-threatening, but they were stressed. Their rumens would need monitoring. Their diets would need gradual reintroduction to their regular feed. The Henderson contract required a clean bill of health from the vet, and I wasn't sure they'd pass without a few days of recovery. They're going to need a vet check, I said to Marcus. At minimum. He nodded and made a note. I'll include that in my report. The county will want to ensure the animals weren't harmed during transport or exposure. Patricia had followed us to the pen. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her jaw was clenched. This is absurd, she said. They're goats. They eat brush. That's what they do. They're not damaged. They're fine. They're not fine, I said. Nigerian dwarves have specific dietary needs. You drop them in a field of unfamiliar plants without any transition period. You stress them with transport and handling. You separated them from their regular shelter and routine. Any livestock owner would tell you that's a problem. But you're not a livestock owner. You're an HOA president who thought goats were just lawn ornaments. The photographer had put her camera away. The teenage volunteer was standing near the water bucket, looking like she wanted to disappear. The residents who had gathered were whispering to each other. I caught fragments of their conversation, stole them. $18,000. Private property. Can't believe she did that. Richard, the treasurer, was on his phone, speaking in a low, urgent voice. I assumed he was calling the other board members. Patricia's green initiative was collapsing in real time, and everyone could see it. Marcus finished his documentation and turned to Patricia. I'm going to need a statement from you, he said. You'll need to explain why you entered private property, removed livestock without permission, and transported them without proper documentation. You can provide that statement now, or you can provide it later with an attorney present. Patricia stared at him. Her polished confidence had completely evaporated. She looked smaller somehow, less like a community leader, and more like someone who had just realized how badly she had miscalculated. I want my attorney, she said finally. That's fine, Marcus said. But the goats are going back to Mr. Mercer's property right now, and the HOA is going to cover the cost of the veterinary examination and any necessary treatment. He looked at Richard. Can you confirm that the HOA will cooperate? Richard nodded slowly. The board will discuss liability, he said. But yes, the goats go back now. The loading process was quiet and awkward. The same HOA trailer that had taken my goats was used to return them. Marcus supervised while the teenage volunteer and Richard helped guide the animals back into the trailer. Patricia stood off to the side, her arms still crossed, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. The residents watched. Someone was still recording. By the time we got back to my property, it was almost noon. We unloaded the goats into their pen, checked the water and feed, and made sure the gate was properly secured. Marcus took a few more photos for his report, and then handed me a copy of his preliminary findings. I'll file the official report this afternoon, he said. The county takes livestock theft seriously, even when it's dressed up as a community initiative. I thanked him and watched his truck disappear down the gravel drive. Then I called my vet. Dr. Elaine Park was a large animal veterinarian who had been working with my herd since my father's time. She arrived within the hour and spent the next 2 hours examining each goat individually. The news wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. Clover had a minor muscle strain in her back leg. 2 of the wethers showed early signs of digestive upset from the sudden forage change. 3 of the does had elevated stress indicators. Elaine recommended a gradual reintroduction to their regular feed, probiotics for the whole herd, and at least 5 days of rest before any transport or grazing work. 5 days, I said. The Henderson contract starts in 6 days. Elaine looked at me over her glasses. They might be ready by then, but you're cutting it close. If they're not fully recovered, you risk the contract and the health of the animals. I'll write up my findings. You'll want documentation for whatever comes next. She handed me a detailed report and a bill for $420. I added it to the folder. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and paperwork. My attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres who specialized in agricultural law, sent a demand letter to the Willow Creek HOA. The letter outlined the unauthorized taking of livestock, the trespass on private property, the conversion of commercial assets, and the tortious interference with the Henderson grazing contract. It demanded reimbursement for the veterinary costs, compensation for the potential loss of the contract, and a written acknowledgement that my property was not subject to HOA authority. The HOA's attorney responded within 24 hours. The response was defensive but not dismissive. They wanted to negotiate. They wanted to avoid litigation. They wanted to make this go away. Patricia Calloway had been suspended from her position as HOA president, pending an internal investigation. The environmental committee had been dissolved. The brush clearing initiative had been deleted from the HOA Facebook page, though screenshots of it were already circulating in local livestock groups and community forums. The public reveal happened on Saturday, 3 days after the goats were taken. The HOA had scheduled an emergency board meeting to address the situation, and someone had leaked the agenda to half the neighborhood. By the time I arrived at the community clubhouse, the parking lot was full. Residents were filing into the meeting room with expressions that ranged from curious to furious. I took a seat near the back with Rebecca Torres beside me. Marcus Webb was there too, sitting near the front with his county badge visible and a folder of documentation on his lap. The board members filed in, looking exhausted. Richard, the treasurer, was acting as interim president. Patricia Calloway was not present, but her absence was louder than her presence would have been. Richard opened the meeting with a brief statement. The board is aware of the situation involving livestock belonging to Mr. Daniel Mercer, he said. We are cooperating fully with the county livestock officer's investigation. We have suspended Patricia Calloway pending the outcome of that investigation, and we are in discussions with Mr. Mercer's attorney regarding appropriate compensation. A woman in the front row raised her hand. Is it true she took the goats from private property? Yes, Richard said. The security footage confirms it. Another hand went up. Is it true the HOA could be sued for $18,000? Richard hesitated. The board is reviewing the potential liability. We are committed to resolving this fairly. The room erupted. Residents started talking over each other. Some were angry at Patricia. Some were angry at the board for not supervising her. Some were worried about what this would do to their HOA fees. One woman stood up and demanded to know if the HOA's insurance would cover the damages. Another man asked if Patricia would face criminal charges. Marcus stood up and raised a hand for quiet. The room settled slowly. The county is investigating potential charges of livestock theft, trespassing, and animal transport violations, he said. Those are Class A misdemeanors in Texas. Each one carries potential fines and jail time. The district attorney will make the final decision on prosecution. The room went silent. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Richard looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 3 days. The board will cooperate fully with any investigation, he said. We want to make this right. Rebecca Torres stood up. My client is willing to resolve this without litigation, she said. But the terms are non-negotiable. The HOA will reimburse all veterinary costs. The HOA will compensate Mr. Mercer for any loss related to the Henderson grazing contract. The HOA will provide a written acknowledgement that Mr. Mercer's property is not and never has been subject to HOA authority. And the HOA will issue a public statement clarifying that the goats were taken without permission and that Mr. Mercer bears no responsibility for the incident. Richard looked at the other board members. They nodded. We agree to those terms, he said. The meeting adjourned shortly after. Residents filed out in small groups, still talking in hushed voices. Some of them approached me on the way out. A woman with a kind face and a Willow Creek tote bag stopped to say she was sorry about what happened. A man who introduced himself as a retired veterinarian offered to help with the goats if I needed anything. The teenage volunteer from the brush clearing initiative found me in the parking lot. Her name was Kayla. and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "I didn't know," she said. "Patricia told me the goats were donated for the program. She said it was all approved." "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," I said. "You were trying to help." She nodded, her eyes wet, and walked away. The aftermath took several weeks to fully settle. The HOA paid the veterinary bill within 7 days. The compensation for the grazing contract took longer to negotiate, but eventually they agreed to pay $12,000. The full contract value was $18,400, but since the goats ultimately recovered in time to fulfill most of the agreement, the damages were reduced. The Henderson farm was understanding. They had dealt with livestock complications before, and they appreciated my transparency. The contract started 3 days late, but it was completed successfully. The goats performed beautifully, clearing the invasive brush exactly as specified. The farm paid me in full, and the HOA's compensation covered the delay penalty and the additional veterinary costs. Patricia Calloway resigned from the board before the investigation concluded. The county ultimately decided not to pursue criminal charges, citing her resignation and the HOA's cooperation as mitigating factors. But the damage to her reputation was done. The story had spread through the community and beyond. Local livestock groups had shared the Facebook screenshots. A regional farming publication had run a short piece about the incident. Patricia's name was now associated with goat theft, and that was not the kind of legacy anyone wanted. The HOA's new board sent me a formal letter acknowledging that my property was outside their jurisdiction. They also sent a fruit basket, which I gave to Kayla the volunteer, because she looked like she needed it more than I did. The goats recovered fully. Clover's leg healed. The digestive issues resolved. By the time the Henderson contract was complete, the herd was healthy, happy, and back to their normal routines. I stood on my back porch one morning, about a month after everything settled. The sun was coming up over the pines. The coffee was hot in my hand, and the pen was full of familiar sounds. Bleating, shuffling, the occasional headbutt against the metal gate, the right kind of noise, the kind that means everything is where it's supposed to be. I thought about my father, about the promise I made to him, about the business he started, and the animals he loved. He would have handled the situation differently, I think. He would have been louder, more confrontational. He never had much patience for people like Patricia Calloway. But he also taught me that the best revenge is documentation, paperwork, records, the kind of evidence that doesn't depend on who yells louder or who has more social power. Patricia thought she could take my goats because she was the HOA president, and I was just some guy with a small farm on the edge of the community. She thought her authority meant she could do whatever she wanted. She thought wrong. The grazing contract was in my folder. The security footage was on my USB drive. The property deed was in my safe, and the livestock officer had my back. Some people think authority comes from being loud, from having a title, from standing in front of a crowd and making announcements. But real ownership is quieter than that. It's recorded in county files and signed contracts and veterinary reports. It's the kind of thing that doesn't need to shout, because the paper does all the talking. I finished my coffee and walked down to the pen. Clover came over to the gate and pressed her nose against my hand. Her leg was fine now, her eyes were bright. She was ready for whatever came next. So was I.